You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Last week being the first week of a new issue of TBR magazine would have been dedicated entirely to a discussion of the content of that magazine, a recap of the issue of TBR between myself and TBR editor Paul Angel. But we decided to push this forward for a week so that we could do the special election recap last week. I got a lot of emails and so forth this week wanting to know, Dr. Ed, why didn't you talk about the election fraud? And there was a lot of election fraud. In fact, on Friday, it was all over the radio that over 500,000 ballots just magically appeared in Arizona. 115-some thousand ballots just magically appeared in South Florida. And it appears that the Democrats are figuring out how to steal the election. Why aren't you discussing this election fraud? But that recording was recorded on Wednesday, the day after the election, and then it aired on Friday. The election fraud had been uncovered hours before our broadcast went to air. We had already recorded it ahead of time, and that's kind of one of the disadvantages, I guess, of only doing an hour each week. But it is what it is. Again, just some great conversation about TBR magazine and all the great stuff that is in the November-December issue of TBR magazine. Paul and I do something a little different because this past issue of the magazine, there were 5 articles in there by myself, which is not the entirety of the magazine. There are over a dozen articles in the magazine, so I didn't even do half the content. But I did do 5 articles, and the magazine was kind of built around the 5 articles that I wrote in some ways. And so Paul had asked me, he said, what if we reverse the format of the show just a little bit, and instead of you interviewing me, how about if I interview you? And so that's what we're going to do, and it's going to be kind of a unique experience, but I think you're going to enjoy it, and I think you're going to enjoy the 5 articles that I wrote, mainly basically World War II related articles, as well as an article about Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, who was basically, his 47-year military career was brought to an abrupt halt when he was fired by the United States military for having done nothing more than trying to honor his Confederate ancestors, being, of all things, a professor of Civil War history at a military college. You'll want to stay tuned for this one. About toning down TBR. Maybe the article was there and I read the issue and missed it, but I didn't see any of the controversial subjects in the past TBR.
No, this last one I did tone. It's Christmas time, so, and generally at that time of year we don't put in too much. But, I mean, there's so many things in history to cover, so many interesting things that I don't think we have to, and you've said the same thing, right, that we have to talk about the same stuff over and over. Just that's what I get from my writers, and that's what the best stuff is, generally. Right. So I've always said we should talk more about us and less about them.
Well, I had no idea you would run as many of my pieces. I was trying to submit them thinking, I might not have time to write them later, so I'll get a few issues ahead.
Right. Well, they kind of went together, too. I mean, we had the Japanese, we had Tokyo Rose, and we had the Battle for Alaska, and we had the Von Vera piece, which is an upbeat piece. And then you had the Nathan Bedford Forrest, the third piece, right?
Yeah, 4 and 5 were World War II stories, so yeah.
Yeah, and people love that stuff. But yeah, okay, tell you what, and since you had so many stories in this issue, it might be an idea to reverse roles for a portion of this, where you talk about the story, then I ask you questions about your stories. And let's see then. So let's open up that issue and let's get going because I got somebody coming here at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
So, and of course, you had a lot of articles in this issue. They were all very good. So I'm going to ask you a few questions now. One of your stories was one I'd never heard of. I guess I should have because a movie was made of it. It was called The One That Got Away. And it was about Franz von Vera, W-E-R-R-A. Had you heard about this guy before we talked about the story?
No, I remember you had mentioned the movie to me and the story, and so I went and I found the movie and I watched it. Actually, the movie was pretty easy to find. It's on archive.org, and so I was able to download it and watch it. And when I was a kid, my favorite TV show was Hogan's Heroes. And this was like Hogan's Heroes in reverse.
Right.
And so, instead of the Allies having the underground tunnels and the escape committee and Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz being the Doomkampfs and so forth, here you had the Germans who were the POWs, and they were digging the underground tunnels, and they had the escape committee, and the British were the ones who couldn't keep them inside the fence.
Right. And at that particular point in time, one of the things I noticed in your article was that when officers would escape, it looked like the Brits, the Canadians, the Allied jailers would say, oh, well, he escaped again, put him back in jail. Maybe he served a month or so in solitary, but it wasn't like massive punishment. It was expected that they were going to be, that German officers would try to escape. Von Vera was a fighter pilot, right? He got shot down over the Battle of Britain, I think, right?
Yes, sir.
And what was the story there? He got caught by the British and told he was going to escape?
Well, he was caught by the British. His plane was coming down, and there were some farmers that saw the plane coming in. And so they ran about a quarter of a mile across their field there. There was a cook from a local army base who was also working on the farm. And so these farmers, they come and they basically captured him. He didn't put up any resistance. He wasn't in a position to put up any resistance. 3 unarmed farmers were basically able to apprehend him. They were able to bring, the cook basically, brought him in and said, hey, this guy crashed in my field or whatever. And, they took him, they inducted him as a prisoner. From the very beginning, he kept basically asking the British, when were they going to put him in a prisoner of war camp? They just asked him, I guess, why are you wanting to escape or whatever? And his answer to that was, of course I am. That's every officer's duty is to escape. Every moment that you have me in custody, I have an obligation to try to escape and return to my own army.
And I understand he promised them he would escape the Brits, right? And when he did escape, I think he escaped several times. One time, and with other prisoners, most of them were captured immediately. Right. But he sent a postcard or something?
Yeah, he did. Well, I think it was his 4th or 5th escape attempt, and he was actually out for several days. He was out for the better part of a week before they were able to recover him.
Right, and he sent him a postcard that said, I told you I was going to escape or something?
Having been captured in Britain, having been out for however many days he was out, they said, you know what, this guy's pretty good. We've got to send him somewhere where he's not even going to try to escape. So they decided to ship him to Canada. They're thinking,
how did that turn out?
Yeah. Well, they're like, even if this guy, why would he try to escape from Canada? He's not going to swim the Atlantic Ocean. But what he did do was he escaped from Canada. He jumped from a transport train in Canada, and he walked however many miles to the St. Lawrence River. And then he forded the river on foot because the river was frozen. And he crossed into the United States, and it was 4 or 5 days before the Canadians even realized that he wasn't in their country. They were looking for him in their own country, not even realizing he had crossed the border. But what he had done was, as soon as he crossed the border, he walked towards the lights, he walked into the town, and he sees a hospital. And so he goes in and he sees a policeman, and he surrenders himself to the policeman. He shows him his identification papers. He says, look at my clothing. He says, I'm an escaped prisoner of war. I'm a German fighter pilot.
So at this particular point in time, we had no...
Right, yeah, the United States was a neutral country. And so he was basically requesting asylum, on the grounds that he was in a neutral country. So this cop doesn't know what to do. So the cop takes him into the police station, and the desk sergeant doesn't know what to do, and a bunch of phone calls are made. And finally they decide, well, the only crime he's committed is that he crossed our border illegally. They turn him over to immigration, and immigration charged him with an unlawful entry into the country and basically let him make a phone call to the German consulate. And the German consul came and posted his bail or did whatever they had to do, and basically agreed that they would keep him in the consulate. By the time the Canadians even realized he may have been in the United States and were seeking his extradition, he was already in the custody of the Germans. So the Germans were like, oh yeah, we already sent him to Mexico. And he went from the German consulate in New York to a German consulate in Mexico to a German consulate in South America to a German consulate in Italy to a German consulate in Spain, and ultimately back to Berlin, and a big celebration by the Fuhrer himself because he had escaped all the way from Canada back to Germany.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah. And that's when he sent the postcard. He sent the postcard to the very first British officer who interrogated him at his first capture. He sent him a postcard that was postmarked in the United States just before he crossed the border into Mexico.
For years, of course, looking for artwork for the Burns Review, I've always seen this picture of this German officer with a lion cub on the wing of his plane. Had no idea that was Von Vera. As I was looking for a caption for that particular picture, I found that there was a great, the lion cub's name was Simba. Great story. And Von Vera ended up going back and flying again, right?
He did. Nobody knows exactly what happened. Well, when he first came back to Germany, he got married, and he was given a headquarters job in Berlin. And the Germans, when he told about his story of what happened, it was how he was treated in the POW camps, the German authorities, first of all, decided that obviously their POWs were being treated a lot better than they thought that they were. Their response to that was they immediately started treating the Allied POWs a lot better than they had been. I don't think it was that they were mistreating them or
treating them poorly per se, but there were definite improvements in the way the POW camps were handled, because they felt like, well, if the Allies are treating our prisoners so well, then obviously we'll treat theirs well also. When that job had kind of played out and he had helped the Germans kind of rework their interrogation methods based on some things he had learned by being interrogated by the British and so forth, he went back to flying. Apparently the Germans had a new type of an aircraft, and he was one of the pilots of that new type of aircraft, and he had several kills. He was doing really well in air raids on the Eastern Front. He was quickly becoming one of the big heroes of the war. He was racking up kills. One day he was actually running a test flight. It wasn't even in combat, and they don't know what happened to him. He just didn't come back. Of course, he never turned up ever again. So the assumption was that his plane just, went into the ocean somewhere, and that was that. No body was ever recovered, no plane was ever recovered.
And that ended his career. But he is now known as the one who got away. And I'll wrap that discussion of that article up by saying that movie that was made about him was made in, 15 years after World War II?
It was made in the 50s. I want to say 1957. It was still in black and white.
Amazing to me that just 12 years after the end of World War II, they're making this popular movie about a German hero. I guess maybe the propaganda hadn't hit so hard. It was pretty popular, I thought.
And the actor who played him had actually been a POW.
To those people who aren't familiar with the magazine, you've missed a lot. Over the past 25 years, we're running our 25th year, Ed.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
And of course, you had quite a bit in this. I thought that when you and I had talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest, between the two of us, he's one of our heroes. I didn't even know that Nathan Bedford Forrest III, his grandson or great-grandson, which was it?
His great-grandson.
Great-grandson was a World War II general. And of course, now everything that has Nathan Bedford Forrest III on it, they want to remove. This particular story was entitled Political Correctness and the Censored Legacy of Nathan B. Forrest III. What can you tell us about Nathan Forrest III?
Well, Nathan Bedford Forrest III was one of the early generals in the Army Air Corps, which, would later become the Air Force. And he was not your typical combat general. In fact, he was a lot like his grandfather in the sense that he liked to lead from the front and not from the rear. So he was commanding air raids and battles from an airplane in the air rather than doing so over a radio or from a command headquarters 200-300 miles away. For example, if there was a bombing raid in Germany, the other generals would be at a headquarters in Great Britain somewhere, and they would be commanding everything from there, safely well away from any fighting, any action. But not Forrest. He would actually pilot a B-17 to Germany, and he would be the lead plane in the formation of multiple planes that were making a bombing run.
A job in which you don't have much of a chance to survive through the number of missions that you're required to do before you're out.
Right, over half of these pilots were not even going to come home alive, and yet he still chooses to be the pilot of the lead plane in the formation and command these missions from the air. And of course, being the first plane coming in, he's the first plane being shot at, and he takes the brunt of the fire. This particular mission, half of the planes didn't make it back, but Forrest stayed at the controls of his plane, and he was able to keep the plane in the air while the other 9 members of the crew, of course, you have co-pilots, you have people who sight the bombs, who drop the bomb. You got a navigator. You've got a multi-person crew just to drop these bombs from a plane. It's not like one pilot can just control everything with levers and switches. He is able to keep the plane in the air while the other 9 members of his crew are able to parachute out of the plane to safety. And then he
sacrificed his life.
Yeah, he did. And he was the first general. He was the first Allied general to be killed in combat. And, he was a national hero. Well, I'll put it this way. When his plane went down and the Germans recovered the wreckage of his plane, his body and what was left of it, they buried him with full military honors. The Germans were that impressed with him that he was buried in a German cemetery with full military honors by the Luftwaffe.
And in the United States, he had been decorated with a Distinguished Flying Cross, a Purple Heart,
yes, sir,
the American Defense Service Medal, an American Campaign Medal, and the European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal. Pretty impressive. And so nowadays, they are suppressing this guy's, obviously, because they don't want his name anywhere. Have they had his name removed from anything, or was anything named for him, or what's the story there?
The only recognition that he had was a museum display at Combined Arms Research Library, Carl. The museum display was actually put up by Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, who was a professor of history for several years there at the college, and who's also a Sons of Confederate Veterans member, and done a lot of research on both Nathan Bedford Forrest and Nathan Bedford Forrest III. And the museum display had been up for several years, and nobody had even thought anything about it until one day there was a black officer who's now, this was years ago, of course, who's now retired, and he just happened to be walking by, and he just happened to notice the name on this display was Nathan Bedford Forrest III. And I don't even know that he complained about that. I think he just made a comment in passing. But the Army High Command went into hyper paranoia mode. That if some other black person realizes that the name Nathan Bedford Forrest is on this museum display, the inmates are going to start running our asylum. And so they immediately ordered the museum display to be taken down. All I can say is the name Nathan Bedford Forrest struck terror in the Yankees in the 1860s, and apparently it still does, even when the name is Nathan Bedford Forrest III and it's his grandson.
Right. And now you mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Ed Kennedy, a guy that you interviewed, and people should listen to that interview at the Barnes Review Radio Archives. Lieutenant Colonel Ed Kennedy pops up again in our magazine in an article entitled Officers Black History Month Exhibit Ordered to be Dismantled. Well, this Ed Kennedy must be some horrible racist. Am I right?
Well, I actually know Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy. I haven't really hung out with him probably since about 2006, 2007 when I lived in Kansas. Actually, when even some of this was going on, I was the chaplain. I was the division chaplain for the Kansas Division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And I made the rounds to all of the SCV camps, speaking to them during the course of the year. And, of course, he was an officer in one of the camps. And I had met him, and also Colonel Jim Spiker, who is mentioned in the article, was another professor at the college there, because the Army College is in Leavenworth, Kansas. Colonel Spiker and Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy, they were professors of history there at the Army College. They were both members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. They had been asked in, I want to say it was around 2000, 2001, to put up a display for Black History Month. They decided that since they were doing some research into Black Confederates at the time, and then the Black History Month came up, they said, well, you know what, let's put up a display honoring the black soldiers who fought. And you would think that they had just set the building on fire. I mean, we can't do that because we can't admit that there were any blacks that fought for the Confederacy. The display was immediately wrapped in brown paper until the Army High Command could decide what to do. And finally, the Army High Command had somebody else replace the display, and they replaced it with all things with a display of Barbie dolls, and they weren't even black Barbie dolls. They were just Barbie dolls.
So Kennedy was simply trying to, he is a son of Confederate veterans, simply trying to honor those who fought for the Confederacy. But this is a fact. This is information that they don't want anybody to know about.
Yeah.
It's the number. It's kind of like Nathan Bedford Forrest the first, I guess you'd say, and his the way he treated his black soldiers, because he had a lot, right? He had a black chaplain, didn't he?
Well, not only that, but Nathan Bedford Forrest was the only Confederate general that actually had a bounty on his head. Abraham Lincoln put a bounty on his head, and I want to say it was $10,000 to whichever soldier could establish that he was the one who killed him or captured him. And so Forrest always was surrounded by 80 bodyguards, and these 80 men were men who previously had been his slaves. But when the war broke out, he freed his slaves. Having freed them, they voluntarily chose to enlist themselves in his military unit, and he actually tried to discourage them from doing this at the beginning of the war. He freed them, he gave them money, he tried to send them to go do whatever. Several of them insisted on staying with him, and serving in his military unit. And when his life became in danger from this bounty that was placed on his head, 80 of them formed a bodyguard unit. And Forrest couldn't go to the bathroom without 80 black men basically standing in a circle around him. I don't think there was a racist bone in Forrest's body.
And neither Lieutenant Colonel Ed Kennedy.
Yeah.
But Kennedy, because he put this display up, his life was made miserable, correct?
Yes.
What did they do to him?
Now, Colonel Spiker came under discipline from command there at the college and from the Army command because he was still active and they could do that. And they harassed him so bad that he finally ended up retiring from the military and becoming an investigator with the FBI. Lieutenant Colonel Kennedy, on the other hand, he had already retired from the military. He still retained his rank, of course, of lieutenant colonel, and he was still a professor at the Army College. But having been retired from the Army, he was there as a civilian contractor who just happened to have, military rank and title. So they did not have the direct line to punish him, if you will, that they did to Colonel Spiker because he'd already retired.
Right.
They could still make his work environment very hostile for him. And so he took a position with the state of Kansas, and he was in charge of the ROTC programs in the high schools in Kansas. And then he found out that working for the government of the state of Kansas and working in the public school system was even more politically correct and even more hostile than the Army was when the Army was trying to make him uncomfortable. Yeah, so
how did the tail end for him?
Well, he went back. He went back to the Army College. Apparently, whoever they hired to replace him as a professor after a few years. So they asked him to come back. They had a different command chain at the college at the time. And so he figured things would be better. And he said they were for a number of years. And then the whole Nathan Bedford Forrest III museum display became an issue. And unlike the Black Confederates museum display, that was, one, supposed to be a temporary display, and two, was taken down within hours of when it was put up, the Nathan Bedford Forrest display was a permanent display. It had been up for a number of years. And then now suddenly it's being taken down. And all of a sudden, even though there was a different command chain that he was under, it was the same song and dance. And, they really came on him. They were always auditing him. They were always putting things in his file and his reviews that just weren't true. Ultimately, he finally wound up being fired as a civilian contractor. And remember, he was a professor of military history, and they fire their professor of military history because he has a Robert E. Lee coffee mug in his office.
Better he would put William Ayers. He'd still be employed.
Yeah.
Well, listen, that's a great story. For all the remaining details, you need to get this November-December 2018 issue of TBR at the website. That's www.barnesreview.org. Listen.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press.
AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
World War II is funny. You think you know everything, and there's so many things we don't know. People always say about the Civil War and World War II, World War I, oh, we know it all. But I had completely just ignored the fact the Japanese had actually occupied U.S. territory in World War II. And this was yet another story that you had given us a good synopsis of, which was the battle for Alaska and the Japanese occupation. The American public was probably in apoplexy during World War II when they found out that the Japanese had successfully taken more than one of the Western islands in the Aleutian chain. The Aleutian chain is amazingly long, right? I mean, it crosses 2 time zones. And one of them is under Russia, which I always thought that they kind of, I know the big part of Russia was pretty close to the big part of Alaska. But the Japanese all of a sudden showed up, took over a few islands there, and that was where the story began. Tell us a little bit about the battle for Alaska, the Japanese occupation, and the inevitable ousting of the Japanese from that. According, right, this was the only battles of World War II on North American soil.
At the time it was happening, the American people were very much aware that it was going on, and they didn't care how many people and how many dollars and how many bombs and how many airplanes and how many anything it took to get them back, just because it was a matter of national pride. In subsequent years, these battles got lost to history because the Battle of Midway was taking place at the same time, and for whatever reason, the historians chose to focus on that and not the battles in the Aleutians. A lot of the historians also that did write about the battles in the Aleutians would say, well, they were irrelevant, or, the only reason we invested so much into recapturing them was because it was a matter of national pride, but there was no strategic importance. They even dismissed the Japanese presence of being there. The Japanese only went there so they could say they captured some American dirt. But really, it was a very strategic place. And the reason it was strategic, and the reason the Japanese invested so much in holding it, is because they had half of our Pacific Fleet tied up trying to recapture these 2 islands in Alaska. That meant that half of the fleet wasn't down into the South Pacific messing with the Japanese there. It also meant that the battle line was drawn several thousand miles away from the Japanese homeland. So it was really strategical brilliance on the part of the Japanese, because they kept the United States totally occupied and far away from their borders. And had it not been for them so stubbornly holding those Aleutian Islands, probably the battle would have gotten to Japan years sooner than it did. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I got a picture in here I'm looking at in this issue, and there's this tiny little village of some Unanagas or whatever they are.
Like 40 Indians, 40 Eskimos, yeah.
Right. But the terrain there is amazing. I mean, it goes straight from a small, tiny plain up to these huge mountains that look like they have glaciers on them. Of course, the United States military is always well known for sending clothing made for Africa to people fighting in Alaska, right? What was the story on the arming of the Americans, or the clothing that they were sent there into this freezing weather with pathetic uniforms?
Yeah, they again, whether it was a mistake or what happened, they ended up sending a bunch of jungle gear, to these guys who were about to go fight in the tundra in Alaska. And so thousands of them could never even made it to the battle because they succumbed to frostbite before the first bullet was even fired. And they had to be evacuated off the island, thousands of them. because of frostbite.
But the Japanese were pretty well prepared.
Yeah, and the Japanese just took advantage of that just to keep digging in, to move, to shift, to take the high ground, to do whatever they needed to do.
You know, for many years, I mean, talk about Hogan's heroes. What was the other one? It was McHale's Navy, right? Was
yes.
The other World War II comedy? And we always had heard the little Japanese friend of theirs who had deserted, and they didn't want to turn him up because they knew that any Japanese soldier who had turned himself in as a prisoner would be taken back and killed, right? But he was always yelling, "Banzai, banzai." Well, evidently, Attu, where it was Attu and Kiska were the two Aleutian Islands in which the Japanese had taken. And this was like one of the first big banzai attacks, so we put in a filler about that. And it's amazing. The Japs fought to the death. Nothing was ever easy with them. But I'm looking at this picture, and there's it looks like hundreds of them just strewn across the ground. I guess once the American forces had taken their positions or gotten the best of them, they just decided to do a frontal assault. They held the grenades against themselves, blew themselves up. I mean, you think that this was the ferocity of the battle there, even though it involved relatively small numbers of men, I guess, was just horrendous. I mean, these Japanese were tough.
Well, the Americans invaded the island with 30,000 men.
That's no small force.
Yeah, because they had their intelligence reports had told them that the Japanese had a force of 20,000 occupying the island. In reality, the Japanese only had 2,800 men on the island. So this massive invasion force of Americans comes in. And yeah, and those Japanese died to the death. I want to say there were only 8 of them, and I would have to double check that number. But it was you could count them on your fingers and toes, the number of Japanese who were captured at the end of that attack, and none of them were officers. All of the rest of them literally died in the banzai attack. I mean, when they made the attack, they knew it was going to be a fight to the death. For every one of them that died, they killed 2 or 3 Americans, and then there were another 2 or 3 Americans who were incapacitated in the battle due to frostbite.
Right. Interestingly, Canada, draft instituted. Is that right? Or they instituted a draft later in the war, but they ensured that they wouldn't be sent on foreign soil to fight. So what did the Canadians do? Were a little worried, I guess, themselves about the Japanese on those islands. So they sent the Canadian troops off to help the United States take back the Aleutian Islands, saying that this was because it was only on North American soil.
Right.
So it kind of began a precedent for Canada and their own involvement, which they probably regret, their own involvement in World War II. And I guess inevitably we know that there were Canadian troops on the ground at D-Day, right?
Yeah, they were. And
yeah.
all of the Canadian soldiers were on foot, and the reason why, and the Canadians may have had vehicles that could have withstanded cold weather, but the Americans supplied everything for the mission, and so these Canadians they had trucks, they had transports, they had tanks, they had all of the machinery, but none of it would start in the cold weather, and so the Canadians were literally forced to move on foot and fight in hand-to-hand combat because their guns froze, their trucks froze, their generators froze. I mean, everything.
Situation normal.
Yeah. And so maybe had the Canadians been using their own equipment, maybe they would have had stuff that could have withstood the cold weather. But the stuff that the Americans sent them just crapped out in the cold weather, and they were stuck marching and fighting hand-to-hand.
Breaker one. Might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all. Got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
When we talk about watching Hogan's Heroes, I remember that they also, this is kind of a lead into another story you did for us here. We always heard about the voice of Tokyo Rose, right? They'd sit around and listen to Tokyo Rose. And we all know what we think we know about Tokyo Rose, was she was a dirty, rotten traitor. And she was a Japanese American who flipped sides and was giving away vital information, American information, to the Allied side. And first of all, I didn't know much of her real name was Eva Tagore de Aquino. I guess she had married a Filipino. But she was an American citizen, never renounced her citizenship. And she had gone to Japan to take care of an ill family member and got stuck there when the war started. Tokyo Rose wasn't just one person, right? I mean, it was like 13 different women.
Right, there were several. And in fact, Eva Tagore didn't even start broadcasting until about 3 years into the war. So there were several women who were basically Tokyo Rose before her, and there were several women who were Tokyo Rose after her.
That's interesting. So she was convicted of being a traitor, right?
She was. Basically what happened was when the war broke out, of course, she could not return home. And she had presented herself to the United States Embassy there in Tokyo, but she did not have a passport. She did have identification papers, but she did not have a passport. And so they told her, well, we've got to be able to issue you a passport. Rather than just issue her a passport, they sent an application to Washington, D.C. Of course, then they evacuated their embassy, and she's kind of left behind because the passport didn't get there in time.
And she didn't call herself Tokyo Rose. She called herself Orphan Annie?
She called herself Orphan Annie because when she grew up in California as a little girl, she liked to read the Orphan Annie comic strips.
So she was pretty much American and fluent in English.
Yeah, she was. She was a Girl Scout, raised as a Christian, graduated from high school in California. She went to the University of Los Angeles and got a bachelor's degree in zoology in 1940. So yeah, she had just graduated from UCLA when she had gone to Japan to care for her sick aunt. Then she's stuck there, and her aunt and uncle kick her out of the house because she's an American. And they don't want to have the Japanese government chastise them in any way for having an American in their home, so they kick her out. The Japanese government basically wanted her to renounce her American citizenship, and then they would have just made her a Japanese citizen and life would have been good for her, but she would not do that. So they declared her an enemy alien, and, she couldn't get a ration card, she couldn't get a job, nobody would hire her because she was an enemy alien. The police, they didn't arrest her, but they followed her and monitored her, everywhere that she went to make sure she wasn't engaging in any untoward activities. She finally succumbs to starvation, and she ends up in a hospital, and she's being treated for malnutrition. And the Japanese government comes to her and says, look, we know that you're not a threat to us, but, you can't live like this. They're like, here's the deal. We will give you a job, and, you will be able to sustain yourself. Now, she still had her classification as a resident alien. They didn't make her a Japanese citizen. But, they said, here's the deal. They said, we will pay you X number of dollars a month or whatever, which came out to like $7 American a month or whatever it was. But they said, we will give you a job. And basically all she had to do was read American newspapers and listen to American radio shows, news broadcasts, and translate them into Japanese so the Japanese could read them and know what they said. She wasn't giving up any classified information. She wasn't handling anything that wasn't already being printed in an American newspaper, that wasn't, say, being, spoken on U.S. Armed Forces radio, but she would translate them into Japanese so the Japanese would be able to read the American news reports. And she did that for a couple of years. And while she was doing it, she would take a little bit of her extra money from her paycheck, and she would buy extra food, and she would smuggle it into POW camps to Allied prisoners. And so she got to know some of the Allied prisoners through doing that. And then the Japanese came to her and they transferred her from the whatever office she was working in. They transferred her to Radio Tokyo. And they said, you're going to work for the radio station. And she did the same thing. She would translate American news stories. She would translate American radio broadcasts into Japanese. And every once in a while, the Japanese would maybe give her something in Japanese and say, translate this in English so we can send it to the Americans. But again, it was nothing top secret, nothing classified, nothing that would have constituted treason on her behalf. And then the Japanese started this policy of making American prisoners of war do propaganda radio broadcasts. And so they took an old Australian radio DJ who was serving with the Allies. He had been a prisoner of war. They took a Filipino radio personality who had been serving with the Allies, who had been a prisoner of war. And they both knew Iva because she had been smuggling food to them into their POW camp. So they put her with them, and they said, okay, the three of you, you're going to do this radio show. It's going to be called the 0 Hour. And basically the object was they would play popular music that the American GIs would want to listen to, and they would have propaganda that would be mixed in with it. And the three of them had decided amongst themselves that they weren't going to broadcast anything that would be considered un-American or anything that would have been detrimental to the Allies. They weren't going to commit treason against their own countries. And they wrote the scripts accordingly. In fact, most of their scripts, most of their sketch comedy that they did, really what they did was they played a lot of music, they did a little bit of sketch comedy, and most of the sketch comedy that they did was actually making a farce of the Japanese, but the Japanese didn't understand it because the Japanese didn't understand the double entendres and the sense of humor that they were using. And so the Japanese thought they were putting out propaganda broadcasts, and they were really putting out anti-Japanese stuff or making fun of the Japanese, and the Japanese didn't even know it. And sometimes Tokyo Rose would even warn the Americans of impending attack. She would say something like, "Hey boys, this is your old friend Orphan Annie, and I've got some swell records for you to listen to just in from the States, but you better listen to them while you can, because late tonight our bombers are going to come over and they're going to bomb the whole 43rd group while you're asleep. So listen to my records now, because you're going to be dead in the morning, because we're going to bomb you tonight."
So in reality, she was, in many respects, a complete American sympathizer the whole time. She even, I remember, wanted to come back to the United States when she got pregnant so that her child could be born a United States citizen. But how did they get her? At the end of the war, right, Japanese surrendered, right, in August 1945.
Right.
They wanted, was it Hearst, one of the Hearst papers, right, offered some type of a payment, a year's wages of $2,000, right, for an exclusive interview with Tokyo Rose.
Well, of course, there was no Tokyo Rose. Tokyo Rose, basically any Japanese woman who the Allied soldiers heard broadcasting, in their mind was Tokyo Rose, and it could have been any of a dozen or so women. When this advertisement went out, Iva decided, I could use that money, and so she answered the ad, not realizing that it was a trap. And she sat for the interview, and of course then the interview ended up being the evidence against her. But what happened was, when she was arrested, Douglas MacArthur was the military governor of Japan, and Douglas MacArthur and his staff launched an investigation. There were other agencies of the Army that launched an investigation. The FBI launched an investigation, and they all exonerated her. They released her. She was pregnant. Now she wants to go back to the United States and, resume her life, have her baby born, and reunite with her family and so forth. And
so she is cleared of charges and now released of custody.
Released of custody, but she's still in Japan.
With the recommendation of General Douglas MacArthur.
Yes, with a personal recommendation of General Douglas MacArthur. For whatever reason, there was a delay in processing her paperwork for her to be able to return to the United States, because she still didn't have a passport. She's not in custody. She's not in jail. She's free to move about in Japan, but she's still there. And Walter Winchell just wouldn't let it go.
It's funny, I'll let you finish there, but we had an article about Walter Winchell years ago in TBR in which he was basically just a warmongering mockingbird, right, for the U.S. government, putting out whatever propaganda they told him to put out. So I'm thinking, I wonder if he did this on his own or if he had been instigated into it. But at any rate, Winchell wasn't done with her, right? He considered continue pursuing this story that she was some type of a traitor, and she ended up being rearrested and transported to San Francisco in 1948, 3 years later, right?
Right, and it was at that time, it was the longest and most expensive trial in the history of the country. And several of the key witnesses admitted years later that they had perjured themselves in testifying against her, because they had been told by the prosecutors that if they didn't say this, that, and the other thing, that they themselves would be tried for treason.
In our long history, she was only the seventh person to be convicted of treason. I mean, I guess Aaron Burr was one. He wanted to take over the whole country, but this poor woman really didn't do much, and it was fake news.
And the jurors themselves, even the foreman of the jury, said years later that he wishes he would have had the courage of his convictions to tell the judge to stuff it, because the jury would not vote for conviction. Apparently, finally, the judge himself went to the jury foreman and basically told him that there would be legal consequences to the jury members if they did not vote for conviction. So of all of the supposed counts of treason that were brought up in the trial, they had reviewed, actually in the investigation, they reviewed over 300 of her radio broadcasts and didn't find anything in any of them that could really be considered treasonous or un-American. But there was one particular broadcast where she gave away the location of a U.S. ship at sea.
How did she know that?
Because apparently, working there in the radio station office, she had seen, some kind of a Japanese military report.
Right.
And it was actually a bombing target. And so she was trying to warn the ship at whatever location that it was a bombing target that night. But because she actually gave away the location of an American ship over Japanese radio. Yeah.
Which the Japanese already knew.
Yeah, obviously. That was her treasonous act.
So unfortunately, her saga doesn't end there, right? She ends up getting a $10,000 fine and slapped in prison for 10 years. Well, I guess she only served like 6.5
Yeah,
years.
she was the model prisoner, and the original term was she was going to be released and deported. she still wasn't considered a U.S. citizen, even though she had been born here and she grew up here and everything else. Having been tried for treason, she lost her citizenship. And so she was going to be deported. And she fought like crazy and managed to prevent her deportation. And she was able to get a work permit and a permanent residency status. And so she ends up going to Chicago and spending the rest of her life working in a grocery store.
Right. And then she started to think about trying to get a pardon.
She applied to President Eisenhower, who did nothing. She applied to President Johnson, who did nothing. And she had actually kind of given up on everything. And there was just a beat reporter for the Chicago newspaper who had found out about her, had met her somehow because she was working in a grocery store, and he met her and he just got interested in her. So he started chasing the story and he started writing a series of articles. That got the attention of 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes did a special. President Gerald Ford watched the 60 Minutes special. And he kind of let it slip. This woman was really mistreated. He kind of let it be known. He said, if she applied to me for a pardon, I'd be inclined to give it to her.
Right. In the end, she got out in 1956. So I'm sure they started locking her up in 1945. So
yeah.
She did serve time in jail. And she was finally pardoned in 1976. And she lived to be a ripe old age of like 90 or something. Always an American citizen.
Yeah.
Who never, that I know of, ever made any derogatory comments about the United States, even after horrific treatment, which included her jailers at the time in Japan, I believe, American jailers in Japan, leaving the lights on all night, keeping her food away unless she'd give them an autograph, all this kind of stuff. Man, it's what goes around comes around, as we always used to say here. The mainstream media, if they want you to be the enemy, you'll be the enemy. Yeah. And it really doesn't matter who or what you are. But it certainly is a tale of perseverance, and thanks for correcting the historical record on her. And by the way, great job on all that stuff for the Barnes Review. And for those who don't know, Ed is doing this TBR radio interviews, and you really ought to listen. Some of these people that you're interviewing are pretty big. Sometimes I'm surprised that they're willing to talk to us, but there's some gutsy people there, including, Ben Cooter Jones, right? Yeah. And some other big, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Kennedy, some other military figures, and some figures. Did you talk to Schneider? I can't remember.
We did a whole interview with Schneider. And
tell us his whole name and who he was, just so anybody doesn't know who we're talking about.
Okay, well, John Schneider, of course, was Bo Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard. He was Jonathan Kent in the Smallville series. I can't remember the name of his character, but he is the primary have in Tyler Perry's Haves and Have-Nots sitcom, which is currently airing on, forgive me, the Oprah Winfrey Network. I guess John's doing better than expected on Dancing with the Stars right now.
Well, good. I'm glad we haven't destroyed his reputation, because all he had to say was what he thought, and what he thought was just average American thoughts from a guy who's been around. But anyway, John Tiffany, the assistant editor of Barnes Review, did a book review of an interesting story on a white man who had been enslaved by the Nootka Indians. The Nootka Indians being a northwest coast American Indian group related to the Tlingit and the Tsimshian and the Haida and some other ones that are pretty famous, the Potlatch people. That's a very interesting little story of how he stayed alive. He was on the ship, the Boston. And, of course, if you didn't watch out with those Indians, they did have some ocean-going vessels, we'll say, large canoes and such, and they were well organized. They captured this guy, and there's an interview there, kind of, not in response to, but just our general discussion of the American Indian outside of that. I always say to genocide somebody, they don't have to be good or evil. I even think genociding people who are evil are a bad idea. There's always got to be a better idea than wiping out an entire race of people. But here's just an interesting thing about how the Indians behaved, who they thought was valuable, who they killed, how they killed them, how they enslaved them, how they were treated. I thought it was an interesting article by John about the adventures of John Jewett, who happened to have been a blacksmith, which is one of the reasons he and one other crew member survived, was because he was able to forge metals and do things that the Northwest Coast Indians thought were practically pure magic, and not being able to smelt and forge weapons of iron and such like that. And it goes through his I think it was, I'm going to just guess and say maybe 6 years under the being a slave of the Nootka. Interesting little article there. And of course we always like to do some, as you do some nice interviews. I did have an interview on the Night the Right rally too. the Unite the Right rally, too, in Washington, D.C. was supposed to be a big event. I was always up in the air about Jason Kessler, but after, that's his name, isn't it? Jason Kessler. But after listening to him talk about his goals and what he wanted to accomplish with this rally, I felt like it's a guy we should be supporting. He simply wanted to have a white pride march. It wasn't like Nazi flags or anything else. He wanted Confederate flags and United States flags only. Unfortunately, only like 10 people or less showed up. They were met by 20,000 radical leftists screaming, "Die, Nazi scum!" And of course, none of them were members of the Nazi Party or in any of these Nazi groups. They were just white people out to bring attention to the white rights issue. So that's a very interesting interview that was done with Charles Edward Lincoln III, who is a monuments protector. He's fighting to stop these monuments being torn down, not only across the country, but specifically in New Orleans. I think people will find that interesting. Unfortunately, the rally fizzled terribly, and they almost didn't want it to get off the ground. It was amazing. The Metro police. There were more police on just the Metro, or our subway there, than there were marchers. But obviously, and the point of the article ended up being was there were tens of thousands of people who were just, and believe me, behind them is the likes of George Soros. Whether the mainstream wants to say that it's a conspiracy theory or not, we all know that Soros funds not only thousands, well, maybe hundreds, I'm not sure, of 501c3s, but each one of these 501c3s that he donates to has their own 10 to 15 501c3, 501c4s that is out there formulating ways to stop us from talking about what is affecting our lives as white people here, and without hatred or violence. You know what I'm saying? As we all do when we sit here and talk, we can criticize people and we can be criticized, and we don't want to kill you. Okay, it's your First Amendment right. But unfortunately, there is a large group of leftists out there, extremely well organized, who really don't want us to air any grievances that we have. In the last article we'll talk about, and there are a few that we skipped over just because we don't want to give everything away. Well, there is one good story at the end on the militarization of space by Ronald Reagan. And the reason that is timely is because Donald Trump has started talking about creating the Space Force. I don't know what comes out of these things, but usually miniaturization of technology is what comes up with our efforts to go to space. And maybe we did or maybe we didn't go to the moon, but I'll tell you one thing, we invented a heck of a lot of things in that program that we use today. But one of the offbeat articles that we had this year, and this is for real people interested in weaponry, was a history of the hate shooting glove. I thought that was an interesting article, Ed, in that, the CBs, we always figured the CBs are sent in there to go to the beach and they make some trenches and pile up some sand and whatever. Well, these guys were doing all kinds of stuff. These were some of the best paid soldiers in the U.S. military. But it was tough for them to be digging a hole 3 feet under the ground, we'll say, in limited space and have a shovel and be able to fight off, say, the Japanese in particular, because the Japanese might be only 15 yards away while these guys are doing it. So one of these guys came up with a glove, a gun that would mount in a glove, very specific, written by a weapons expert named Michael Heidler, and gives the history of the CBs a little bit. And of course, the CBs were a Navy group, and why the gun worked, what it didn't. It was pretty much hard to reload and hard to fire, hard to aim. But it was just one man's attempt to get the CBs some type of personal protection against troops that were coming over the barricades at them. And again, we had the militarization of space, which is quite interesting. Of course, in that issue, we also are going to give every time, we're going to give you letters to the editor. We're going to give you a couple pages of what we call History You May Have Missed, which is short snippets of very interesting things. What monuments are going up, when monuments are getting torn down, what's happening to Adolf Hitler's home, politically incorrect stuff that for Lord knows how long we'll be able to continue to publish it. But for everybody who doesn't know, every November-December issue also has an index for that year. So if you ever get this November-December issue at barnesreview.org, remember that November-December is going to give you an index for the entire year in which we go through every single story and every single author we have, so you can actually find what we did that year. But generally, that would wrap up our discussion of that particular issue. That's a good one. We have January, February coming out soon. Some interesting stuff there. This particular issue we just discussed was heavy on World War II. Our next one will be a little bit different. We talk about everything from ancient man, Neanderthal man, the amazing inventions of our ancestors, the good and bad things that all races have done, genocides, holocausts, manipulated conflicts, false flags, et cetera, et cetera. So I would encourage everybody to always go to barnesreview.org and grab a subscription. We have those two options, right? We got the print version, which is $56 a year in the United States, and we have that PDF version that's only $36 anywhere in the world. So if you haven't tried Barnes Review, you really got to go out there and try Barnes Review, read Ed DeVries' articles in this issue, and listen to his interviews with all the great people he's got, including myself, of course, right?
Yeah.
And get to know what we're doing, because we're in an age where what we are doing is considered by many to be so politically incorrect that we should be stopped, that we should be silenced. And I think if you read it, you'll just see how ridiculous the attacks are on groups like the Barnes Review, because we're not alone in this battle. Anybody who wants to take a different point of view on World War II or any type of contentious topic that we have, including, say, the American Indian, is going to be vilified and roasted. And Maxine Waters will put you on her list of people that is naughty and deplorable. I do know that, like a story like the Tokyo Rose story, the Von Vera story, and how he was portrayed so soon after World War II without the hatred. Tokyo Rose story, and how Walter Winchell, a newsman, is influential in getting this woman locked up who'd done just about nothing. That fake news has been happening. False flags have been happening. We had an article in there I didn't even mention about Harry Elmer Barnes, our namesake, and his analysis of the Pearl Harbor and FDR administration, Pearl Harbor attack, and the manipulation of the Japanese into that event. And it was written 25 years, I believe 25 years after Pearl Harbor, and it stands today. Our namesake, Harry Elmer Barnes, was one of the most brilliant revisionist historians. He probably started the revisionist history movement. For what anybody doesn't know, revisionism is simply to bring history into accord with the facts, to look at the facts devoid of the propaganda. And with what we see, and it always ties into today, that's my point, is that every one of these stories has some pertinence for today, either what we've been not told, or what we've been told incorrectly, or the involvement of the media in fomenting war and putting out Operation Mockingbird like tools, right? Brainwashing the public. Turn on the news today, 3/4 to 7/8. Well, I can't say that because they get they guess at the weather pretty good, I always say, and they get the sports scores right as far as we know, right? So that's a good portion of any broadcast. But other than that, the rest of it is almost completely fake. And so if you want to see some real history and some real news presented without the filter of political correctness, which ruins everything. By the way, I will say encouraging, talk about hope and anger. I saw an encouraging report recently, to wrap it up, that 75% of the American public, and this includes Latinos, blacks, Asians, whites, American Indians, the whole shebang, are tired of political correctness. They understand it's a fraud, that it's preventing us from talking about the most important topics of the day. And so if you want a magazine or a publication or an organization that's dedicated to just trying to slice out the political correctness and get to the facts, the Barnes Review is a magazine you ought to try. Not going to guarantee you're going to love it. Might be shocked, but I've got 5,000 dedicated subscribers now who couldn't do without it. I can tell you that. We appreciate what you're doing. I thank you for the time to talk about this issue, and we'll hook up with you next time.
Well, that is definitely all of the time that we have for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. It certainly was different for me to be on the other side of the microphone, to have Paul sitting in the big chair and me sitting in the little chair, so to speak, being the one answering the questions rather than the one asking them. But I hope that you enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that it has encouraged you to check out the November-December issue of the Barnes Review magazine. I know that I definitely enjoyed the time that I spent researching and writing the articles that I was privileged to be able to contribute to that issue, and I know that you'll enjoy reading them. The Barnes Review magazine, www.barnesreview.org. And also I want you to go to another website, www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net. That's my website. That's the Dixie Heritage website. And when you go there, you'll be able to check out all of the back issues of the weekly Dixie Heritage letter. And I'd like to send you that newsletter absolutely free of charge. All you have to do is just click on the little sign up button there and give us your email address. And every Friday from now until Jesus comes, Lord willing, you'll receive a free copy of the Dixie Heritage newsletter chock full of all kinds of news and information that you'll want to be reading from week to week. When we send you the newsletter, we'll also send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Again, no cost, no obligation. We just want to put the information into your hands. You'll want to stay tuned next week because we're going to have a great Thanksgiving radio show that I've already recorded for you. I'll be out of town next week, but I've already recorded the radio show in advance, and it just took a lot of great material I had recorded throughout the year but did not use in other radio shows, and we put it together for you just to create a very interesting and I believe entertaining experience. Going to have some great celebrity appearances in that. I'm not going to tell you who it is because I want you to tune in. And so from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless, and because I won't actually be broadcasting next week except for by recording, have a happy Thanksgiving and see you after the holiday.